Good evening and welcome. That's my cat right there. There he's purring. Tonight we're going to be reading from this book, the Encyclopedia of American Indian History and Culture. My cat's birthday is today, so he's allowed to do whatever he wants, I guess, today. Right now he really wants to purr close to the mic, so that's fine with me. But let's just dive right in and hope he doesn't walk through the shot. Here we go. This book is really, really neat. We're going to read this chapter on the Arctic and subarctic today. Here he comes, not just because it's the first chapter in the book, but because I think Arctic is a really good trigger word. Alright, he's gonna go sleep on the bed now. So let's read through this. Let me slide it over. So I'm going to read to you about every Native American and First Nations tribe in the Arctic and subarctic. I'll use my mechanical pencil pointer and we will go through it. So let's start with the Ahtna. The people known as Athabaskan were once a single group, but are now fragmented into many different tribes living across the subarctic regions of the United States and Canada. One of these groups, the Ahtna, or Ice People, settled along the Copper River in southeast Alaska. These people were hunters, gatherers, and traders who lived in 3 separate groups, each with its own chief. Their subarctic location made it easy to find food, from salmon, moose, and caribou to berries and herbs. In their villages, they built winter homes partially underground, using a wooden framework that they then covered in bark. Summer homes were more temporary wooden structures with animal hide or bark covering. To help transport equipment between camps, women and girls used a tumpline, a cloth or animal skin sling. Braced across the forehead or chest, the sling supported a load on the back. The Ahtna traded furs and copper with neighboring tribes such as the Tlingit to the south. When Russian traders arrived in the late 1700s to explore the Copper River, they found themselves outnumbered by the local tribes. The Ahtna forced the Russians to close their only trading post on the river and to retreat, leaving the tribe to continue its traditional way of life for another century. When the United States purchased Alaska from the Russians in 1867, the U.S. government sent its own explorers to the Copper River. They met an Ahtna chief called Nikolai, who helped them to survive in the harsh conditions. He also pointed the way to rich copper deposits. By the early 1900s, the establishment of the Northwestern Railway and copper mines near the village of Chitina had attracted more outsiders to the area. The mines closed in the 1930s, but the Ahtna people continued to live here, fishing and hunting for food as they had in the past. In the 1970s, the Ahtna gained control of more than 1 million acres of land. This was possible through the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971, which allowed Native tribes to establish businesses on areas of designated land. The tribe lives on this land today in 7 villages in the Copper River Basin and one called Cantwell, northwest of the river. Next, we'll read about the Aleut. The Aleutian Islands are a chain of around 100 islands that extends 1,300 miles west from mainland Alaska. The Aleutian people had lived on these rugged islands for thousands of years, and their lives have always been bound to the sea and a few inland rivers. They call themselves Unangan, meaning original people. Traditionally, Aleutian men used bidarkus, a type of kayak covered with animal skins, to hunt sea mammals, such as seals, whales, and sea otters, for food, hides, and fur. Women fished for salmon, hunted birds, and foraged. The tribe used animal skins for clothing and made tools and utensils from animal bones and ivory. The women also wove fine baskets from ryegrass which grew on the beaches. The Aleut people built their sod-covered dwellings, called ulaks, partially underground. The entrance was through the home's grass-covered roof. The heat from the surrounding earth helped to keep the houses warm. Life changed for the Aleut with the arrival of Russian traders in the 1700s. The Russians established trading posts on the islands and coerced skilled Aleut hunters into supplying them with sea otter furs. At times the Aleut resisted the Russians. Many were killed, while others were forced to hunt with them, traveling to the Kuril Islands in Russia, Fort Ross in California, and other locations. By the time the United States purchased the Russian colonial territories in North America, also known as Russian America, in 1867, the sea otter population was dangerously low, and the fur trade was in huge decline. Americans also forced the Aleut people to help them hunt for sea otters, until the animals almost became extinct. The Aleut tribe faced further trouble when the Japanese bombed Unalaska Island and occupied Kiska and Attu during World War II. For their own safety, U.S. troops forced the Aleut to abandon their remaining villages, which was destroyed while they were gone. It wasn't until after the war that the Aleut were able to return and rebuild their communities. More recently, they have received government support. Today, 5 of the Aleutian Islands make up a national wildlife refuge. Elsewhere, Aleut people share land on 3 other islands, in communities that include Dutch Harbor, a dock village, and Nikolski. Some continue to speak their native language and have revitalized some of their crafting and hunter-gatherer traditions. Next, we'll read about the Alutiiq. The Alutiiq, or singular Alutiiq, live on the Kodiak Archipelago, a group of islands south of mainland Alaska, and the nearby peninsulas. Like other coastal people, the Alutiiq have always relied heavily on the sea for their survival. In spring, they caught octopus and shellfish during low tides, while summer brought calmer seas and the tribe hunted whales and sea lions on the open water. In fall, they collected wild plants and berries. They also caught salmon in the rivers and preserved some of it for the winter months, either by smoking or drying the fish. In winter, the tribe hunted land animals such as foxes and otters. Living in large village communities, the tribe held celebrations during the winter months, in which dancing played an important role. Accompanied by the steady beat of drumming, men reenacted scenes from the hunt, and women danced in honor of the tribe's ancestors. There we go. There were about 10,000 Alutiiq people living on the islands before Russian fur traders arrived in the late 1700s. In 1784, armed Russians attacked a group of Alutiiq at a place known as Refuge Rock, near what is now Old Harbor, killing 500 of them. The Russian-American company then used Alutiiq men to hunt sea otters for its fur industry, and forced many to convert to the Russian Orthodox religion. In the early 1800s, the Russians established a city at St. Paul Harbor, now the modern city of Kodiak, which became a major fur trading center. The Russians occupied Kodiak well into the 1900s. Today, a Russian Orthodox church built in 1945 remains a reminder of their influence. The Alutiiq endured 2 major natural disasters during the 20th century. The first, in June 1912, was the eruption of Mount Katmai on the Alaska Peninsula. More devastating than that was the severe Good Friday earthquake of 1964. Huge tsunamis followed the quake. sweeping away homes, businesses, and boats and killing 119 people. Today, the Alutiiq still rely on the sea for their livelihood. Many people work in the fishing industries at Uzinki, Old Harbor, and other Alutiiq villages. They also work to preserve, honor, and celebrate the language and culture of their ancestors. In 1995, the Alutiiq Museum opened in Kodiak. Next, we'll read about the Cree. The Cree are a large group that includes 150 First Nations communities living across central and northern Canada, as well as the Plains Cree groups in Montana and North Dakota. The tribe inhabited such a wide area that its various bands adapted differently to the environments in which they lived. For example, many Cree bands enjoyed the rich natural resources of the pine forests of Canada's subarctic region. Also, the area's lakes and rivers provided freshwater fish, while the land was home to many different animals and plants. In this homeland, the Cree moved around to hunt and gather according to the seasons. Traveling in small groups, they lived in cone-shaped teepees, covered in animal skins in warmer weather. In winter, they built sturdy wooden lodges, which they covered with bark or turf for extra warmth. Different groups gathered together to celebrate feasts in summer. With an emphasis on the sharing of food, such feasts continue today. They are held in honor of the animals that give their lives to ensure Cree survival. In the early 1600s, Europeans began exploring in Cree territory. Cree played a key role in the booming fur trade, not only as trappers but also as guides. By the 1700s, the Europeans had built a number of trading posts, and the Cree settled in villages nearby. European missionaries converted many Cree to Christianity. Constant contact with Europeans led to tragic losses for the Cree. In the 1800s, smallpox swept through Cree camps, killing large numbers of people. From the late 1800s onward, the Cree also lost their homelands through various treaties that forced them to give up their lands. Although many Cree died of European diseases, with determination they rebuilt their communities. Today, the Cree language is spoken across the different bands, and although not all Cree people live on reserves, many continue to hunt and fish to keep their ancient traditions alive. The Cree are active in Canadian politics too. In 2013, Chief Teresa Spence gained fame as a leader of the Idle No More movement that fights for the rights of First Nations people. Next we have, if I can get it all on the shot, I believe so. Anyway, the Dena'ina is next. The Dena'ina have lived in the lands surrounding the Cook Inlet, Alaska for more than 1,000 years. Alaska's capital, Anchorage, sits on Dena'ina homelands. In the past, many Dena'ina had summer fishing camps there. In those days, the tribe built temporary summer dwellings, which they also used for smoking the fish they caught. During the year, the tribe moved from place to place, but in winter they established more settled villages, with families living together in large houses. Built partially underground, these houses had log walls covered with earth and grass. Like the Ahtna, the Dena'ina are an Athabascan people. They are the only northern Athabascan people to live by the sea. On the coast, hunters captured harbor seals, shellfish, and other sea creatures. Inland, they snared bears, bighorn sheep, and smaller animals. In order to become a keshka, or leader of the tribe, a man had to prove himself through his hunting skills. The keshka arranged trade with members of other indigenous groups and made sure that the tribe's hunters supplied enough food for their people. There we go. The Dena'ina had no contact with white settlers until the late 1700s, when the Russians built trading posts in their territory. Interaction with the newcomers led to problems for the Dena'ina, including the smallpox epidemic of 1836 to 1840 that killed many people. Russian missionaries arrived in the mid-1800s and converted survivors to the Russian Orthodox religion. Although the Dena'ina adapted to the Russian presence, they clung to their traditional belief system, partially the idea that all natural things, animals, rivers, plants, and rocks, had supernatural power. The late 1800s brought gold prospectors to the region, followed by more settlers. In 1915, a railroad was built through Dena'ina land, bringing even more people to Anchorage. The city continued to grow in the 1940s when it became the site of a military base, and in the 1950s following the discovery of oil. Today, the Dena'ina live in Ahtna native village, which sits on almost 125,000 acres of ancestral land northeast of Anchorage. The village cemetery has small, brightly colored spirit houses containing mementos of the deceased, a tradition that has roots in the Russian Orthodox religion. Cute. Next we'll read about the Eyak. The Eyak people inhabit a small part of their traditional homelands in southeastern Alaska. Originally, the tribe lived in 4 major villages in the Copper River Delta between the larger Chugach and Tlingit tribes. In each Eyak village, tribe members built 2 potlatch houses in which feasts were held, one with a post topped with a raven, the other with an eagle. These represented the 2 family groups, known as clans, that made up Eyak society. Each group fished, hunted, and harvested plants in its own area. Food from seals, ptarmigan, bears, and mountain goats was plentiful, and the tribe used snares, traps, and bows and arrows to hunt the animals. The Eyak's primary food source was the abundant salmon. The fish swim up the Copper River to spawn in spring, so during spring each year the Eyak left their winter villages to fish. They built summer camps upstream and preserved the salmon they caught by drying or smoking it. In the fall, men hunted duck, lynx, and beaver. The communities had plenty to eat during the long winter. Being a small tribe, the Eyak were targets for slave raids by other tribes. They survived the raids, but contact with the Russians brought them close to disaster. In the late 1700s, the Russians traded with the Eyak, but they also tried to force their own culture and religion on the Alaskan people. At different times, groups of Eyak rebelled, and on one occasion, they helped the Tlingit tribe attack the Russian post in the town of Yakutat. The Russians retreated, but a smallpox epidemic between 1837 and 1838 brought devastation to the Eyak. By the late 1800s, the survivors were living in just one village, Orca. In the early 1900s, the oil industry, railroads, and canneries continued to threaten the tribe's way of life. The fishing industry destroyed the salmon population and forced the Eyak off the land to find more in the canning factories or elsewhere. Today, many members live in Eyak Native Village, now part of Cordova, Alaska, where they continue to preserve their culture. Together with local environmental groups, they work to protect their ancestral homelands and the animals they share the land with, including the salmon, their most important food source for many generations. Next we have the Gwich'in. Gwich'in homelands once covered a large area across northern Alaska and the Yukon Territory of Canada and into the Mackenzie River Valley. By the 1800s, there were 9 bands of Gwich'in people living across this territory. They traded goods with each other and joined together for feasts. The Scottish explorer Alexander Mackenzie met the Gwich'in tribe in 1787 and was the first European to write about it. In his journals, he mentions visiting the tribe's fishing camps. The Gwich'in tribe began trading with European fur traders in the early 1800s. By the middle of the century, the British Hudson's Bay Company had established trading posts at Fort Yukon and Fort McPherson. The company had been set up to trade goods with the tribe for fur. At the time, there was a great demand for animal fur in Britain. Traditionally, the Gwich'in were semi-nomadic, moving around in small family groups, surviving mostly by hunting caribou and fishing. They built domed dwellings, which they made by stitching caribou skins together and draping them over a curved pole framework. By the 20th century, the tribe had established permanent villages in both Alaska and Canada, and they live in these communities today. The tribe is well known for its storytelling, an oral tradition that has passed down from generation to generation, with Gwich'in stories recounted in their native language. The tribe has used a written language since the late 1800s. Lively music is at the heart of many celebrations. Over the years, the tribe adopted the fiddle as part of its culture, and fiddlers play music as Gwich'in dancers perform high-tempo jigs that include the duck dance and the rabbit dance. The caribou is central to Gwich'in culture, with creation stories telling how the tribe is bound to the animal because each has a piece of the other's heart. The caribou was the main food source for the tribes, who also hunted smaller animals and fished for salmon. The animals provided skin for boots, bags, and summer shelters. For centuries, the caribou have migrated north in summer along ancient paths, and the Gwich'in people built their camps on the migration routes. The tribe still hunts these animals, and in 1988, established a committee to protect the porcupine caribou birthing grounds from oil drilling. Next we have the Holikachuk. Originally, the Holikachuk lived in Alaska along the upper part of the Innu River, a 500-mile-long tributary of the Yukon River. Holikachuk was the name of the tribe's main village on the river. During winter, this small tribe lived in subterranean or partly underground earthen homes that had a central fire pit. In the spring, the tribe went on caribou hunts. The animal was an important food source and also provided skins for clothing and blankets. The tribe hunted other animals living in Holikachuk territory, such as lynx and bears. The Holikachuk were traders who exchanged their caribou skin for beads, tobacco, and dentalia, or cone-shaped seashells. Tribal members also obtained Inuit clothing during these trading trips. Many coastal people, including the Inuit, made clothes from sea mammal skins. When other tribes obtained cloth from white traders, the Holikachuk traded for this as well. Eventually, cloth and sea mammal clothes replaced the tribe's traditional caribou skin clothing. During the spring and summer months, the Holikachuk traveled far from their territory to trade and to fish for salmon on the Yukon River. They set up fishing camps there in summer, living in brush shelters. Once dried, the fish they caught kept the tribe fed through the long winter. One of the most important ceremonies during this time was the potlatch, a great feast that the Holikachuk held every December in honor of the dead. I wonder if that's where we get the word potluck. Anyway, the Holikachuk had little contact with white settlers and traders during the 1800s, although missionaries came to the area toward the end of the century, converting most of the tribe to Christianity. Between 1962 and 1963, the Holikachuk moved their village to Grayling on the lower Yukon River. The tiny Holikachuk tribe lives here today, mostly surviving by hunting and fishing. Although the Holikachuk no longer live in their ancestral homelands, today the Innu National Wildlife Refuge protects the animals and plants on millions of acres of land that lie between the Yukon and Innu rivers. Next we have the Iglulingmiut. The Iglulingmiut people live on their ancestral lands on the western side of Baffin Island and the Melville Peninsula in Nunavut, Canada, an area that is also home to many caribou, seals, and walruses. The name Iglulingmiut means there is a house there. Iglulingmiut, a word that has the same meaning, is the name of a large town in the area. In the past, the Iglulingmiut hunted seals through holes in the ice and their two main winter camps. In the early summer, the tribe would move south to the Melville Peninsula to hunt caribou. The tribe's movements were informed by the teachings of the elders about the changing seasons, stars, and animal movements. Using their knowledge, the relocating every 3 years, the Iglulingmiut lived without harming the land or endangering its wildlife. Today, although the Iglulingmiut live in modern communities, they still hunt seals and catch salmon. Traditionally, men hunted and women stayed behind, but today women hunt too. The tribe refers to the food the hunters catch as country food, and communities share it just as they did in the past. The Iglulingmiut lived an isolated life until the 1800s. Before this time, they traded only with neighboring groups, sometimes traveling farther afield to trade with whalers. By the end of the 1930s, the Hudson's Bay companies had set up a trading post on the island of Iglulingmiut in Nunavut. Missionaries and scientists soon followed. During the 1950s and 1960s, the Canadian government wanted the Iglulingmiut people to adopt a less nomadic lifestyle like that of Canadians to the south. The government placed children in residential boarding schools away from their homes in a bid to lessen the influence of their indigenous culture. It took many years for the Iglulingmiut to have schools of their own with Iglulingmiut teachers. Eventually, the Iglulingmiut people settled into their present-day communities in Nunavut, where they balance modern ways with their ancient traditions. Next we have the Innu. The Innu were once a widespread tribe that fell into two main groups. The northern Innu, also known as the Naskapi, lived in the subarctic areas of what is now eastern Quebec and Labrador, Canada. The southern Innu, or Montagnais, lived farther south. Both groups have lived in these areas for at least 2,000 years. Living in a colder climate, the northern Innu traveled around using snowshoes and pulling toboggans. They depended on fishing and hunting caribou for food, clothing, and shelter. They lived in small groups, sharing large lodge homes that were covered in caribou skins. They also used caribou skins to make warm clothes to protect themselves from the harsh climate. The southern Innu lived in a warmer area and wore lighter clothing. They traveled mostly by birch bark canoe. They tracked and caught moose for food and covered their homes in bark. Innu people living on the coast and around the Gulf of St. Lawrence first met European fishermen in the 1500s. In the early 1600s, the French established permanent settlements along the St. Lawrence River. Members of the southern Innu became guides and trappers for the French and fought with them against the Iroquois tribes. Once the British took over the area in the 1760s, the southern Innu stayed closer to the trading posts along the St. Lawrence River, but continued to support themselves by hunting and fishing. In the mid-1900s, the Canadian government constructed huge reservoirs and dam islands that forced the Innu to move into settled communities. Today, while most Innu live in Quebec, there are 2 settlements in Labrador. They call their vast homeland Nitassinan, or our land, and work hard to keep their culture alive. One project they have developed involves an online database of ancestral place names, such as Ushkan Shipis, or Bone River, and Atiku Neyao, or Caribou Point, along with details of their meanings and origins. Next we have Iñupiat. The Inupiat of northern Alaska descended from the people of the Thule culture that developed around 1000 CE. This nomadic society emerged in the Bering Strait, and its people spread across the Arctic region. Surrounded by an icy ocean and frozen land, the Inupiat hunted large sea mammals such as walruses and bowhead and gray whales, as well as caribou, birds, and fish. The Inupiat have deep respect for the ocean and its creatures, particularly whales, and were expert whalers. They built large skin-covered boats from which they could harpoon huge baleen whales. They got enough meat, bones, blubber, and baleen for an entire community from just one carcass. In winter, the Inupiat on the coast used driftwood and sod to build homes that were partly underground. Inland, people made homes from poles covered with skins or sod. At their hunting and fishing camps, the Inupiat made simple driftwood shelters or lived in skin-covered tents. They used soapstone lamps and pots that burned sea mammal oil, and women sewed animal hides into socks, boots, and parkas. For many centuries, the Iñupiat met few outsiders apart from Siberian Yupik and Chukchi people, and few European explorers. In the 1800s, however, explorers, traders, and missionaries began to arrive more regularly. The American whaling industry hurt the walrus and whale population, and today whales are protected by international law. Inupiat people hunt whales under an exemption to that law for native peoples. They do not kill more whales than they need. Today, the tribe maintains a number of its cultural traditions. Every spring, it holds a festival to honor the whale and its importance within Inupiat culture. Whale meat, blubber, and skin are distributed among all who attend. There is much singing and dancing, accompanied by drums made from whaleskin. The festival ends in prayer. The Inupiat Heritage Center in Barrow, Alaska, opened in 1999 and exhibits traditional arts. People can learn the crafts of their ancestors, such as constructing or repairing whaling boats and making tools. Next we have the Inuvialuit. Inuvialuit. The Western Canadian Arctic is home to the Inuvialuit people, who are closely related to the Inuit and Iñupiat. Originating from the Alaskan Thule cultures, they have lived around the mouth of the Mackenzie River and on the shores of the Beaufort Sea for 1,000 years. The Inuvialuit moved from place to hunt and fish. In the winter, hunters caught seals through their breathing holes in the ice. In summer, they hunted beluga whales, and in fall, caribou and musk ox. The Inuvialuit people changed their homes according to the season, living in warm earthen houses in winter and caribou skin tents in summer. Before European settlers arrived, the Inuvialuit had established a trade route along the coast to Alaska. They traded goods such as ivory and copper with other indigenous groups, including the Iñupiat farther west. In the late 1700s, Europeans explored the western Arctic looking for furs to trade, and by the mid-1800s, the fur trade had reached Inuvialuit territory. Inuvialuit hunters traded white fox and muskrat furs. Then American whaling companies followed, although this industry was short-lived. At the same time, missionaries worked among the Inuvialuit people and converted many to Christianity. Unfortunately, all of this interaction with outsiders brought deadly diseases such as measles to the Inuvialuit. By the 20th century, just a few hundred Inuvialuit people survived. By this time, many Inuvialuit were living in communities on the western edge of the Mackenzie Delta. In the late 1950s, the Canadian government built Inuvik, a planned town for the tribe. Other changes came in the 1960s and 1970s as oil and gas companies came to the Arctic. Although many Inuvialuit worked in these industries, they also worried about their impact on the environment and their traditional way of life. In 1984, the Inuvialuit signed an agreement with the Canadian government that provides an area of land, the Inuvialuit Settlement Region, or ISR, rights, and a promise to protect the environment and traditional Inuvialuit culture. Today, thousands of Inuvialuit live in the 6 major communities of the ISR. Next, we have the Oji-Cree and James Bay Cree. Centuries ago, Cree and Ojibwa people married. Their descendants, the Oji-Cree, developed their own identity and traditions, making their home around western Hudson Bay. Their relatives, the James Bay Cree, lived to the east. The Oji-Cree moved between seasonal hunting grounds, snaring hare, caribou, and other animals. The large bay provided beluga whales, seals, and fish, even in the winter, when tribal members fished through the ice. During the summer, people traveled by canoe, but in the winter, they wore snowshoes to haul their belongings across frozen waters on wooden toboggans. Life continued in this way until 1668, when the Hudson's Bay Company established its first fur trading post. More posts followed, and the Oji-Cree began trading furs for European goods such as cloth. French missionaries worked among the tribe, converting many to Catholicism. In 1975, an agreement signed by the James Bay Cree gave up land around James Bay to make way for hydroelectric dams. The dams caused flooding and mercury-contaminated water supplies, killing fish and caribou. The damage forced thousands of tribal people to move far from their homes. Today, the Oji-Cree live in several scattered communities in northern Ontario and Manitoba, Canada. Most places are remote and reached only by plane or boat. The tribe continues to fight for its rights and to preserve its language and traditions. Elders, language phrasebooks, and educational courses help younger tribal members to learn the language of their ancestors. The Ojibwa and Cree Cultural Center contains a library and resource center, while the Cree Cultural Institute, which opened in the town of Uje-Pugumu, Quebec, in 2011, is a showcase of the tribal history and culture of the James Bay Cree. Next we have the Yupik. Numbering some 25,000 people, the Yupik form the largest group of Alaskan Native people. As many as 10,000 of them speak their ancestral language. Traditionally, tribal members moved according to the seasons. In winter, they lived in villages, and in summer, they traveled to fishing camps. On the coast, they hunted walruses and seals, while inland, they caught fish, birds, bears, and other land animals. The best hunters often became village leaders. The Yupik were skilled craftspeople. They carved figures from ivory and decorated their baskets with geometric motifs. Almost all of their clothes, tools, food vessels, and baskets were ornamented in some way, whether carved with intricate designs, woven with geometric patterns, or embellished with fur and feathers. In many Yupik groups, the men lived separately from the women, who resided in small community homes called Ahtna, with their children and other female members of the family. Yupik men still lived in their large community houses called kaskik up until the 1970s. The kaskik operated like a modern-day community center, with all members of the tribe gathering there regularly for ceremonies, singing, and dancing. Ceremonies are still held throughout the year and remain an important link between the tribe's past and the present. During the early 1800s, the Russians tried to establish fur trading centers on the Yukon and Kuskokwim rivers, but these were not as successful as their centers in Aleut and Alutiiq territories. Contact with the Russians caused devastation among the Yupik people when a smallpox epidemic swept through the region in 1837. Today, the Bristol Bay area is home to one of the world's largest wild salmon runs. Yupik people work in the fishing industry and also hunt and fish for themselves. In recent years, climate change has become a threat to the Arctic way of life. The permafrost, a frozen layer just beneath Earth's surface, is melting and the land is eroding under villages. Yupik people in the isolated village of Newtok became the first Americans to relocate because of climate change. Other coastal villages may have to do the same in years to come. And I think that's the last. Yep, that's the last one. So that's it for tonight. Next time we'll go over another region of North America and learn about the Native Americans and First Nations people that live there. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video relaxing and educational. And I hope that you have a very good